Okay. Now we're going to study the risk of meat consumption on cancer, in particular red meat consumption, and we're going to start with colon cancer. So this first study we're going to review was published in 1990 in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was a cohort study that tracked about 90,000 women. They took a food questionnaire in 1980, and then they were followed for the next 7 years. And the highest quintile, highest 20% of red meat consumers were compared to the lowest consuming 20%. And red meat for this study and upcoming studies is defined as beef, pork, or lamb. And in this group, the highest quintile compared to the lowest quintile had a relative risk of about 2.5. That means they were about 2.5 times more likely to develop colon cancer during that 7-year time period. Now, next, there was a study done just a few years later when about 50,000 U.S. male health professionals, also a comparison of red meat consumption, comparing those that had red meat 5 times or more per week, and they had a relative risk of about 3.5. 3.5 times more likely to develop colon cancer than those that were in the lowest quintile of meat consumption. And now keep in mind that as these cohort studies moved along with questionnaires, they asked a lot of other detailed questions like smoking status, exercise, body mass index, whether they smoked. And they were able to compare people with like statuses. So they compared the smokers, the overweight people to the overweight people, etc. And yet controlling for those other potential confounders still showed a very high relative risk of cancer. Well, there are a lot more studies like this one. This is a study of about 30,000 women from Iowa, and this study, which is about 15,000 women from 1985 to 1991. And this study, which is the Physicians' Health Study. And there was this study of about 30,000 people from California from the Adventist Health Study. And this study was done in the Netherlands and had a very significant odds ratio for red meat consumption. And this study had about 87,000 participants from the Nurses' Health Study, and they added to it other health professionals from the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And this study is from Australia. There are about 37,000 patients. And this next study is from Sweden with about 60,000 patients. And then there was another study in 2005 that's really a granddaddy of the studies because there were almost 500,000 patients from across European countries. And they were followed from 1992 to 1998. See, in the 1990s, we had a lot of cohort trials following really a lot of people and with detailed observation of their risk factors and diet for colon cancer, and then comparisons were made. The American Institute for Cancer Research and the World Cancer Research Fund published an in-depth study. It took about 6 years to produce this study. This group reviewed the studies I just went over, and then they were able to do a meta-analysis on that work. Almost every single study had a relative risk showing that red meat consumption increased the risk of cancer. The data is very convincing that red meat consumption increases the risk of colorectal cancer. That there is about a 1.43 times increased chance of getting colon cancer by per each time that you eat red meat per week. And there's about a 1.29 increased risk of colon cancer for every 100 grams of red meat that you eat. When meat is cooked, that the temperature causes heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that have been shown in bench research to be carcinogenic. When you increase the temperature of cooking red meat, you increase the amount of hydrocyclic amines, and it's assumed that that might increase the risk. If that's true, then cooking such as frying, grilling, barbecuing, even gravy would be felt to be more likely to cause colon cancer than cooking red meats over lower temperatures or in the microwave. And when you look at the data, you do see that's true. Foods that are cooked hotter have a higher relative risk, and the red meats that are not cooked as hot, they still have an increased risk of colorectal cancer, but it doesn't seem to be quite as great. Now, there was one other study that might be worth reviewing, and that is you're wondering, well, how much red meat is safe? Well, that's hard to say, but this study was a meta-analysis of the previous studies that focused on the amount, and it concluded that even an amount of 50 grams increases your risk of colorectal cancer. So, in summary, the data is pretty convincing that red meat consumption significantly increases your risk of colorectal cancer. First study, which was published.
You actually said risk of risk instead of effective.
This risk of risk,
yeah.
which is very risky.
Risky.
It could
Okay.
even be risky. Okay.